Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Venable's June nonprofit presentation, which is a virtual fireside chat with state regulators overseeing the nonprofit sector. I'm Eric Berman. I'm a partner with Venable's nonprofit and advertising practices, and I want to thank all of you very much for joining us remotely for what I think will be an informative and enlightening discussion. And wherever you are logging in today, I hope you're staying safe and as sane as possible. Before starting today's presentation, let me quickly preview next month's offering. Those of you who attend these more regularly know that we try to do these about once a month. And our next presentation will be on Wednesday, July 15th, and we will be presenting a panel on how to maximize the value of your brands and creative works during these challenging times. That will be presented by my intellectual property partners, Andrew Price and Megan Kent, as well as Jennifer Homer from the Association for Talent Development. Looks to be a very exciting presentation, and hope you'll join us. Again, that's July 15th. And now let's begin today's webinar, which was really triggered because we're at an intersection of time where between the ongoing COVID pandemic and the recent release in April of Nasco's annual report, we thought it was an opportune time to hear directly from charity regulators about what's on their plate, what does state AG enforcement for nonprofits and their vendors look like right now, what, if any, impact has COVID had on enforcement in the sector. And I will tell you that I could not have had a better group of regulators to talk about these issues than the ones who were kind enough to join us today. So let me introduce them. We have three great panelists. Please remember that the views that each of them express are their own and don't necessarily reflect the views of their respective Attorney General offices. Yael Fuchs joins us from the New York Attorney General's office, where she is the co-section chief of the enforcement section of the Charities Bureau. Yael oversees the efforts of the enforcement section to investigate and litigate violations of New York laws governing not-for-profits and their agents, including breaches of fiduciary duty and fraudulent solicitation, and to work with the not-for-profit sector to improve compliance and governance. Yael is also currently the president of Nasco, the National Association of State Charities Officials. She's been an adjunct professor at Cardozo Law School, where she taught a seminar on the work of the Attorney General's Social Justice Division. Prior to joining the New York AG's office, she was a litigation attorney at a major New York firm in private practice. She also served as a foreign law clerk at the Supreme Court of Israel. Yael earned her JD from Columbia Law School, where she was a James Kent Scholar and an editor of the Columbia Human Rights Law Review. Thank you for joining us, Yael, as always. Mary Henderson joins us from the Texas Attorney General's office. Hi, Mary, where she serves as senior attorney for charitable trusts. Mary's had a long and distinguished career in public service. She has now served 5 different attorneys general in Texas. She spent over 5 years as the Associate Commissioner of Long-Term Care Regulatory Services for the Texas Health and Human Services Commission. Before that, she spent 16 years with the Attorney General as the Deputy Chief and Managing Attorney for its Consumer Protection Division, where she played a significant and active role overseeing their charitable trust activities. Prior to that, Mary was a general litigator with the AG's office. She was also in private practice, and she was an attorney in the General Counsel's office within the University of Texas system. Mary graduated from Stevens College and from Baylor University School of Law. She is board certified in civil appellate law by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization, and she is a member of the American Board of Trial Advocates. Hi, Mary. Thanks for joining us. Last but not least, certainly, we have Beth Short, who joins us from the Ohio Attorney General's office. In preparing for this, I asked Beth what her job title is, and she said it depends on what day of the week. So today is Wednesday. We're going to call Beth the Director of Outreach and Education for the Ohio Attorney General. She clearly wears many hats. She's passionate about the nonprofit sector. Beth has spent her career working for nonprofit organizations as a staff member, as a board member, a consultant, a volunteer, for organizations large and small. She has a background in journalism, legislative and public affairs and training. She holds a master's degree in business that is focused on nonprofit management issues. Her work in the charitable law section focuses on the development of strategies aimed at strengthening the nonprofit sector. She is a graduate of the Ohio State University and Ohio University. And this is such an accomplished panel that I'm exhausted just introducing them. So why don't we get right to it? Thanks all three of you for joining us. Yael, let's start with you, but of course I want to hear from everybody on just about every topic, but as the president of Nasco, perhaps you can just describe for our audience, what Nasco is, what it does, why our audience members should care about it.
All right, thank you, Eric. Thank you for having us. Hi, Mary and Beth, wonderful to see you as always. Can you hear me, Eric?
I can.
Okay, great. So NASCO, the National Association of State Charities Officials, is exactly what the name suggests that it is. We are an association of the state officials in all 50 states and DC and other territories who are charged with the oversight of charitable solicitation and in some instances, charitable governance and the oversight of charitable assets. We come from Attorney General's offices. In some instances, we are housed within Secretary of State's offices or consumer protection agencies.
And so that's an excellent background. And I know I've been to NASCO's annual meetings. I think people, within the industry there's sort of a public day that's open to everyone. And then you guys all shroud together in secrecy and really talk about things. But clearly information exchange among charity regulators is a big part of this. Tell us about that, right? If you're sort of regulated in this industry, you kind of want to know, boy, how do these guys know this? Or, if I'm contacted in Ohio, will I also be contacted by a regulator in Texas? So tell us about your information exchange.
Sure. So as I believe your listeners know, charities in this country are regulated both by the IRS in terms of their tax-exempt status and also by state law. And of course, states have different approaches to charities regulation. Some of them approach it as really a consumer protection issue with a greater focus on the solicitations, making sure that they're free from misrepresentations. Other states also have oversight over certain major life cycle events of charities, the creation of charities, changes in mission, the divestment of assets, mergers, dissolutions, and yet other states also would look at the internal governance of charities and the way that they are serving their beneficiaries and enforcement of the fiduciary duties, of course, the essential concept when it comes to the relationship between boards of directors and charities and charitable beneficiaries. Every state has a different approach. Charities are primarily regulated by the state of their incorporation, but charities reach out into other states. Many charities operate across state lines, whether programmatically or in terms of soliciting. So you might be a charity incorporated in Texas, but you are reaching out into New York to solicit money from New York donors. Perfectly acceptable, but that means that you need to be registered in New York State for that activity, and you need to be providing us with certain reports. So because of the cross-border nature of the activity, it's just so important that charity regulators communicate and coordinate. And we do that for two fundamental purposes. First, to make the regulation more efficient, to share expertise and best practices. Ohio, for example, is really a leader in outreach and public education. So I will call up Beth and ask her to send me her latest guidance and her latest presentations so that I can respectfully basically copy them and take all of her best ideas and not reinvent the wheel. The second reason why we all want to get together is because enforcement and regulation is really a nationwide issue. If you have a bad actor in one state, what you don't want is for that state regulator to devote a lot of time and energy on enforcement activity and then have that bad actor just move across state lines. So we want to encourage information sharing and coordination so that we can do our job as efficiently and effectively as possible.
I see some nodding heads. Anything to add from Beth or Mary?
Well, I just think she's exactly right. There's a real collegial and professional relationship between all of us, and we all know that we can feel welcome to pick up the phone. And, you know, maybe you have a new investigator on staff and they've never dealt with a certain kind of case. There's someone somewhere else that will be willing to help coach and mentor someone. When we were designing our new online charitable registration system, which isn't all that new now at this point, but we called and talked with other states about how they did it, what things worked well, and what things we should avoid doing. And so none of us have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to resources in trying to address our role within the charitable sector, because we all want it to operate above board and that donor dollars are properly protected and used to advance appropriate missions. And so, you know, we all have limited resources to do what's on our plate to do. And so using the wealth of experience that exists is, you'd be foolish not to. So we greatly appreciate Nasco. And when my president calls, if she calls me and asks me to do something, I am all about doing it because it's been so valuable to me in so many ways when I've been assisted.
My general rule to life is when Yael asks you to do something, you just do it. I'm not even part of Nasco, and that's how I live my life. Mary, did you want to add something?
I was just going to say, what's really great about Nasco is that it is so inclusive. And we have regular calls where we do talk about, potential cases that may be in the works, or there may be issues that we want to address. And we want to be consistent in how we're addressing those issues. Even though our laws may not be the same, sometimes there's things that we can do, on a consistent basis across the board. Or if there is a state that is already acting on some particular matter, the other state may not want to jump in right away. They may want to see how that goes, or they may want to consider a multi-state action. And, we do coordinate and try to talk through those issues to ensure that we are, working a case as best we can. I think Beth really hit on it. We all have limited resources. People think that we have unlimited resources because we're the Attorney General's office, but that's not true. We are limited in what the span of what we can do. And so we want to be able to coordinate in the best way possible.
And Eric, if I can add one more thing, if it's not obvious, one other reason for Nasco is also to provide a unified voice in the way that we interact with the sector. So with charities, with folks like you, the professional advisors to charities, to legislative bodies, to other regulatory agencies. So it's through Nasco that state regulators have submitted comments to the FASB on proposed rule changes. We've also submitted comment letters to Congress and the IRS on Schedule B legislation. And this is also a way for the sector in turn to reach out to us and not to have to make calls to 50 different offices, but to have one place to go in order to express any concerns.
Absolutely. And there's actually a few points that you all raised that I think are excellent segues into other questions. And I'm not sure what the ideal order is, but, Mary, you mentioned multi-state actions. And as someone who, often represents or defends charities or professional fundraisers, in regulatory actions. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. And, frankly, you often would rather not play a game of whack-a-mole where you're dealing with 6, 7, 10, 12 different state AG investigations. There's sort of economies involved with multi-state actions. Can we expect to see more of those? Are we trending more toward multi-state coordination in terms of law enforcement? Any of you have some thoughts on that?
I mean, it all depends on what comes up. I don't know about trending. They've been around, multi-state coordination's been around for a long time. So I think it just depends on what the issues are and what we're seeing.
I think we are seeing increased. Go ahead, Beth. Sorry.
Well, I was going to suggest that maybe all these multi-states have gotten the message out that fraud is not welcome and will face consequences. So maybe there won't be a trend.
It's alleged fraud, not fraud.
Alleged.
I will say, I think every year we're seeing more and more communication and coordination. We're also seeing increased sophistication. The better job that we as Nasco and as regulators can do of training new assistant attorney generals, of flattening the learning curve, if you will, the more we can bring our institutional knowledge to bear. And I think in that way, the actions are going to be, and the interventions are becoming increasingly sophisticated. So where before maybe, you saw a multi-state action in order for states to leverage resources, now you're also seeing states partnering together, maybe because one state has the primary jurisdiction, another state has a toolkit of remedies that may not be available. And it's through communication and coordination that we are learning about each other's respective reach. So I do think, that it's an available tool for sure.
Absolutely. And sort of part and parcel with that, because again, I could see some complication where there's, let's say, a multi-state action with 10 or 12 offices and they don't have the ability to get the same type of relief, and you don't want kind of a patchwork. But at the same time, for conduct that is national in nature, might state AGs also partner with federal law enforcers in the nonprofit sector? Certainly, there was the Cancer Fund case involving the Federal Trade Commission. There's been others, sort of law enforcement sweeps. But let's talk about that a bit. What are we seeing in terms of coordination with federal law enforcement here?
Our primary partner in enforcement and in education and outreach has been the Federal Trade Commission. And thank you for the opportunity, Eric, to give them a shout out. Such an important partner in terms of their nationwide jurisdiction, some of the remedies at their disposal. The telemarketing sales rule is a very important tool. A lot of what we deal with is telemarketing and direct solicitation fraud. We also work with criminal law enforcement at times when appropriate. We have worked with the Federal Election Commission and with the IRS. But I would say that the FTC is probably the longest standing partner in enforcement.
And I want to follow up on that, and I just need to interrupt for 1 second because it looks like we have a question from a listener who just asked for the acronym. So this is NASCO, NASCO, the National Association for State Charities Officials. Just to clarify that. I have had the experience, and I'm certain that other private practitioners in the nonprofit space have had this as well. Where an organization says, I'm a C3 charity. the Federal Trade Commission can't touch us. They don't go after charities. I have a response to that, which costs money. But how, what's the regulator's response to that?
Well, the Federal Trade Commission, and I don't want to speak for them and their jurisdictional reach. That's not my area of expertise. But they can go after what they consider to be sham charities. And so it is, and they have jurisdiction over the telemarketers. So if you think that you are a charity and the FTC is coming after you, that is because they believe that in fact you are not a bona fide charity. And so what you are conducting is essentially a fraudulent business practice that is within their jurisdiction.
Right. And that is true. A C3 or other exempt designation from the IRS is not, that does not answer the jurisdictional question under Section 4 of the FTC Act. If Tracy Thorleifson is listening in on this, she'll be smiling to hear that. We talked about limited resources. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Given limited resources, I presume your offices have to prioritize some things over others, some educational outreach initiatives, some law enforcement against particular types of conduct over other, perhaps less risky or less, harmful types of conduct. Could you each tell us what priorities are on each of your desks right now in the nonprofit sector? Let's start with Mary.
Okay, well, we are kind of bifurcated in some ways. So, Charitable Trust Group, we both review cases that come in under our state law as a notification to the Attorney General of any litigation involving a charitable trust, or if there is a charitable entity that is a beneficiary under a will, and there is some conflict with regard to that will. So we have a large chunk of practice devoted to intervening in charitable cases which we haven't initially brought per se. We also represent state agencies as beneficiaries of charitable trusts. So we may engage in intervening on their behalf. And then we have those cases that you typically consider, fraudulent activity, or charities that may not be providing the appropriate distribution of funds to the charitable cause. And that provides another section of our work. And then we have where there are cases involving deceptive trade practices. Those cases are generally handled through our Consumer Protection Division, and we may partner with them in investigations related to breaches of fiduciary duty, and they may take the aspect of the case regarding deceptive trade practices. So we may jointly file an action, and we have some pending investigations right now where we're coordinating with our Consumer Protection Division, looking at fraudulent activity at the same time in regard to what the charity is doing. Finally, we have a registration statute in our office for law enforcement telephone solicitation. So we look at those entities, on a regular basis that are making those phone calls, soliciting on behalf of law enforcement. And those registrations are not huge, but that is something that we handle in-house in our office. So it's kind of diverse. It's all over the board as far as the work that we do. So I'm not seeing a specific trend as far as, what are investigations that we are going after per se. We look at a wide variety of fraudulent activity by charities. Potentially, we're looking at trustee fees in the private foundation area. We're looking at a kind of an array of different types of cases within the charitable sector. We receive
Excellent.
consumer complaints, and it may be that we receive consumer complaints such that that sparks an investigation, depending on what is complained about.
If I had a nickel for every time I told a client donor and consumer complaints, whether to the BBB, your state attorney general, or the Federal Trade Commission, sparks investigations, I'd have a lot of nickels. That is certainly a trigger that we tell people to be wary of. Beth, I know that your office has been very active. A recent survey about COVID's impact on the sector, and I don't know whether this is breaking news, but a forthcoming webinar on COVID. Tell us what's new and exciting out of your office.
Well, I think our office has, as one of its many priorities, and we have everything on our plate that both Mary and Yael have discussed. But we do invest some effort in outreach and training, and I have a motto of we're trying to help good people do good things the right way. So if we can keep people out of the investigative side of our office by giving them resources, tools, and information, it makes things better for everyone in the charitable sector. And so back in the good old days, I used to travel around and do a lot of training for statewide associations and that sort of thing. Obviously, we're not doing that right now. But when the coronavirus started, it was readily apparent that this is going to have a huge impact on charities throughout the country. For every effect that we read about going on within the business community, it's happening with our charities, large and small. And so right away, we wanted to get information out to charities with some tips. For instance, the Ohio Nonprofit Corporation Law permits teleconference board meetings unless the bylaws prohibit it. Wanted to let charities know you need to keep meeting. Please don't see this as an invitation to drop your board governance responsibilities. In fact, they may be more important now than ever before. We want you to keep up with your internal controls. You may be closing a facility, but that doesn't mean that you don't need to pay attention to mail coming in that may hold checks. So we wanted to put out a number of, talking points and notes about things they should be mindful of. And so we've also developed, we have a webinar out there now on some of those basic operational issues that people should be mindful of. We also have a webinar out there that's on fundraising tips for charities during this difficult time. We had 2 experts in fundraising consultants, one of whom is on our Charitable Advisory Council. And we are lucky in that probably maybe 15 years ago or so, before I arrived in the office, the General Assembly created by rule the Ohio Attorney General Charitable Advisory Council that is comprised of folks with all different kinds of experience within the charitable sector. And we convene them regularly to get their feedback on what they're seeing out there in the real world, to give us feedback on new approaches we may be thinking about, new training modules. They often volunteer to serve as guinea pigs. When we developed our online registration system, they were helpful in helping us test it and that sort of thing. So it's a chance to get feedback and suggestions and have them give us a thumbs up or a thumbs like, oh, not so sure about this one. But we were able to use their expertise in some of these tools we've put out there for charities during this coronavirus challenge. And so 2 of the people on the fundraising webinar happened to be members of the Charitable Advisory Council. And then we also partnered with 2 other members of the Advisory Council in doing a statewide survey of charities. And so we partnered with Philanthropy Ohio, which is our statewide association of foundations, and a professor at Ohio State University, go Bucks. And we put together a statewide survey. We reached out to every registered charity, asking questions about how the coronavirus situation has impacted them. And we got back 7,700 responses, more than 7,700 responses from charities of all sizes, huge, complex organizations, as well as tiny grassroots ones. We're also planning to repeat that over time so that we can really get a snapshot as it moves along in terms of what the coronavirus situation has done to the charitable sector. And we've completed round one. Right now, we're doing a similar survey within the faith community because exclusively religious organizations don't need to register with our office. All Ohio charities and any charity soliciting Ohioans must be registered. So we also don't have easy contact information for all the churches, temples, synagogues. So it's been reaching out through partners, many of whom serve on our advisory council, to try to get a response about what's been the impact on faith communities. And so then we'll continue over time. And I was a little surprised by some of the results of the first round of the survey because I kind of expected we would see the level of concern kind of ratcheting up over time as we go back to revisit it. But the level of concern within the charitable community already started at 11. So they were immediately concerned about the fiscal impact, and we heard about a number of major fundraising events that had to be canceled, and absolute consternation about what's going to happen in the future, how long is it going to happen. Some of the results showed that 50% of the charities, and again, this was within the first month, this was published, our report was published May 4th, available online, and there's also a webinar about it. 50% of the charities responding had already reduced services, and a number of them, 28%, were considering already were not doing any services at all. So a combined response means 78% are either not doing services or have already reduced them. You know, a huge portion. Already, happily, 51% had already started doing meetings virtually. 1/3 had already restricted travel. A fourth had tried other ways to reduce expenses. 23% cut training already, and 18% had already started using reserved funds. 30% who have staff have already started cutting staff, and 26% more expect to. So
it sounds like Mary's dog is outraged by these survey results.
Yes, so am I.
I'm sorry.
But the Philanthropy Ohio was interested in sharing these results with policymakers at both the state and federal level, and so I know that tool has already been used in discussions with the governor's office and how we craft state relief services. So we're just trying to put things out there that may help charities know they're not in this alone. Unfortunately, it's a sad boat full of too many people. And to also let decision makers know that, yes, businesses have been hard hit, but indeed, so has the charitable sector that so many people rely on.
Absolutely. And actually, there were some bits of information in there, Beth, that segue really nicely with some questions that we're actually getting from the audience. We're starting to get some questions pertaining to fundraising. And, you had mentioned concern about cancellation of fundraising events. Certainly that's something that people in my practice have been seeing is, canceling hotels and convention centers and whatnot. Charities still have to raise money. Perhaps you go online, perhaps you hire a telemarketer. So one question from one of our attendees is, have your offices been seeing a spike in complaints from the public, from donors, perhaps even whistleblower actions regarding either fraudulent fundraising or misappropriation of funds or resources, especially given what's happening with COVID right now? Any insights on that?
So I'll speak to that. One of the ways that Nasco has been coordinating is us aggregating the information that states are getting on complaints and enforcement actions. And interestingly, we are not seeing a lot of fundraising fraud surrounding COVID. I saw more complaints and incidents of fraud after Hurricane Sandy, for example. And I think you can speculate as to why. It might be because of reduced giving across the board. I think that this crisis has hit everybody economically. I think that a lot of giving that is happening on online platforms. And in those cases, the first line of defense very often is going to be to report it to that platform if you have suspicions about a particular campaign. And those platforms, to different degrees, will do their own due diligence and might take action, including suspending or pulling down campaigns. So I think that's a lot of what's going on, and so the problems aren't necessarily reaching the Attorney General. We are seeing some cases. We're seeing cases of the look-alike and the sound-alike charities. We're seeing some cases of kind of a combination of charitable solicitation and price gouging, especially as it relates to PPE, raising money from the public in order to procure equipment for first responders, and then giving that contract to your brother, right? So classic related party transaction, which is very highly regulated, at least under New York law. But overall, I would say we are not seeing a spike. One thing that we're talking about is, you know, we're going to be regulating in a new environment now. We're going to be regulating in a recession. And regulating in a recession is very different and poses different challenges, you know, that we all saw the last time around in 08, 09 and lasting several years thereafter. So I would not be surprised if we see kind of some collateral impacts of the crisis come to our attention in the coming months and years. When charities reach tough times, that's when embezzlement starts. That's when people start selling off property and pocketing the proceeds. So we're all on the lookout for that. And at the same time, as Beth, I think, wonderfully demonstrated, the priorities of many offices right now are really to support the sector in this time and to provide whatever guidance we can and to get the information from the sector so that we know how to be responsive.
One of the things that we're doing, and what we all know from past experience, is when a tragedy happens, some sort of disaster, a shooting in a community, floods, there will be people pop up who are raising funds as individuals. They're not affiliated with a charity. And God bless their enthusiasm about trying to do something to help their community. But what we also know is that we'll get a complaint 6 months down the road that Mrs. Smith never turned over the money that she promised to give to the local fire department. And so we're stuck trying to backtrack and figure out what happened. And so we're being very active in monitoring various fundraising platforms for Ohio-related campaigns like that are done by individuals and not by charities. And we are reaching out to them all because by raising funds for a charitable concern, you've created a charitable trust under Ohio law, and you should be registered, which will cost you nothing when you have no assets. But it is more importantly an opportunity for us to give them the clue that what you're doing is serious and you should treat it with care. And so we're also talking to them about the importance of keeping records about funds that come in and funds that go out so that there's no questions that arise down the line. So we're hoping that that's helpful in putting people in the right frame of mind as they're engaged in these activities that sound like they're trying to have a positive impact, but making sure that it actually does.
I see one question where folks are looking for the Ohio report, and I know that's available on your AG's website, but I will also direct people to the Nasco website, which is nasconet.org, and that has a link to the Ohio report and to the annual report that I think we're going to talk about, to our state survey of registration laws. We're really focused on making it as useful for the sector as possible.
Absolutely, and because we're, we have about 20 minutes left, so I think there's clearly a lot of interest in internet activity. I think that things like telemarketing fraud and things like that are easier concepts to grasp. Let's talk about the internet a little bit more. We've sort of been touching on it. It is always a challenge, it seems. I think both to people in the sector, to their counsel like me, and even to regulators like you all, to take statutes and regulations that have been around for a while and modify them to meet changing technologies and changing circumstances. I think a lot of people would be, surprised to learn that starting a GoFundMe or, doing some sort of solicitation on a platform now potentially subjects them to state laws, in the sector. There's a question about internet-based fundraising and the Charleston principles, right? Which are not law, but they are guidelines that you all look to determine if there's sort of sufficient contacts in the state because of the fundraising activity to require registration and perhaps go after the fundraising activity. Is there anything afoot going on there? Any consideration of revising the Charleston principles, or just any thoughts you could share with our audience about internet fundraising, whether it's a donate here button or something more active?
Well, there's lots of talk about revising the Charleston principles. Again, my personal take is that the Charleston principles basically enshrine kind of very basic jurisdictional minimum contacts, as we lawyers learn in Civ Pro 101 principles, which is, if you're doing business in a state or if you are specifically directing your business into the state, we're going to have jurisdiction over you. So I don't know, and I'm open to this discussion, to what extent the Charleston principles themselves need to be modified. I'm sure that there are people out there who've done some great thinking on that, and Nasco is open to your input. I think internet fundraising, it's been around for a while, and in some ways existing registration laws apply, and in other ways they don't. And I think we're right now where we are is an ongoing evaluation and dialogue about that process. This has really brought to light the ways in which some registration statutes don't address really popular forms of fundraising. As Beth alluded to, and as you did, Eric, if I start a GoFundMe and it's not to pay for my medical expenses, because that's not charitable, right? But it's to raise money to buy PPE for healthcare workers, what I am doing is a charitable activity under state law, going back to, I think, the 1601 Statute of Elizabeth in the UK. And so you are subject to charitable regulation. We are grappling with what to do about that. Are we gonna, and states have different approaches, whether you're gonna reach out and ask everybody to register, and then it means that you might also be subject to certain governance requirements in that state. In New York, that would mean you should really have 3 directors and certain internal governance procedures. Right now, speaking for New York, we are taking a look at the high money, the high value campaigns, because I think the real difference is that these kind of campaigns can raise amounts that were previously unheard of, right? It's very different than having the jar out on the counter of the deli. You have a GoFundMe that can go around the world and raise hundreds of thousands of dollars. GoFundMe does a pretty good job vetting on the front end, making sure that the campaign organizer is somehow tied to the cause, and they have their own algorithms that they use and their diligence that they do. But none of them are doing any checking on the back end. Nobody is watching how this money is being spent. And that's really the job of the regulators. And I think that we would be remiss if we just turned the other way and said, you know, the internet is kind of too complicated for us to be involved. So regulators it's a constant conversation. And there are states like California that have proposed legislation on crowdfunding, and other states that are considering similar regulatory changes.
I think that is a constant challenge across the board, right? I know that state regulators and also the Federal Trade Commission, which, as you mentioned, does have jurisdiction over for-profit charity fundraisers. There's an expectation that the fundraiser will do some vetting to make sure that its representations in its call scripts, for example, your money will go to help take veterans off the street. Well, there should be some vetting at a minimum. Look at the 990 and see how much is spent on charitable programs. But it does strike me as a more difficult question. What are the obligations of a platform, of an Amazon Smile, of an eBay charity, reputable companies, and are they a passive platform, or do they have to be much more active than they have been, lest they risk enforcement action? Sounds like we won't arrive at an answer today, but I know it's something that our clients struggle with, and I don't know. If anyone does have an answer.
And even as a passive platform, is there more that they could be doing in terms of disclosure, in terms of providing information to the entities that are using their platform about their legal obligations?
Absolutely. With our time remaining, I feel like we should maybe bookend this, end as we began. We began by talking about what Nasco is, and the fact that Nasco just released its annual report. So maybe we should talk about that. I think the contents therein would be very much of interest to our audience. This is something that came out in April. Could you talk a bit about what's in it, what lessons could be learned from this annual report for those who haven't read it? What are some useful tidbits of information here?
Sure. So the annual report is a compilation of some of the major actions by all the states in the area of charity regulation. It's not an exhaustive list, but we cover deceptive solicitation, enforcement in the areas of governance and breaches of fiduciary duties, the type of trust and estate issues that Mary mentioned, healthcare issues, still a lot of work in, a lot of the hospital consolidation and mergers happened in previous years, but are still ongoing. We're seeing a lot of changes in the nursing home arena, and I imagine we're going to see a major uptick in changes in the nursing home arena. Sorry, there's a truck idling outside of my window. I'm going to close the window so you all can hear me.
I actually couldn't hear it.
And then a section on the changes in registration, a lot of states going online, new legislation and guidance. So we hope that this gives everybody, I think it does give a really great overview of the types of activities that states are undertaking in this area. You see a lot of action in kind of our bread and butter core fraudulent solicitation work. both in the area of charities that are total shams, and we're trying to shut them down. In some instances, criminal action is brought, but also in the area of legitimate charities who cross the line in terms of their representations. California, for example, and Michigan were very active in the area of gift in kind donations and charities that misrepresent the percentage of their donations that are going to their program services, where certain charities pad that amount by inflating the value of their gift in kind program. Maybe that's a lot of jargon. To be more specific, you have organizations that accept donations from pharmaceutical companies. They overvalue those drugs and then say, you know, our program was worth $100 million because we distributed $100 million worth of pharmaceuticals, when in fact those pharmaceuticals were distributed overseas, and the $100 million represents the US prime retail value of those pharmaceuticals. And so California takes that activity very seriously and has been active in regulating that. We see a lot of activity directed towards self-dealing by trustees and directors. New York, of course, brought the Trump Foundation action, which was focused on related party transactions. And we see a lot of states looking at private foundations and self-dealing by the officers and directors of private foundations. And then, as you know, our theme is you also see a lot of work by states in helping charities through their life cycle events, helping them through major asset changes, major asset sales, helping them through dissolutions. So I think it's a great guide to what we're up to.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier that some charities think, you know, oh, I can't be touched by the Federal Trade Commission, for example. They're surprised to learn that they might be. Looking through the annual report, there were a handful of law enforcement actions which were referred to criminal authorities as well. And I would imagine there's some listeners out there who think, you know, again, I work for a charity, or I own a charity, quote unquote. How could I be accused of a crime? But alleged fraud is alleged fraud.
And I think, Eric, what's even more important is when there is criminal activity within a charity, you have that bad actor who embezzled money, who wrote checks to himself, who created a shell entity. That happens, that can happen. But then how does the charity respond? And that's what we as civil regulators are really interested in. What did you do? Circle the wagons and sweep it under the rug? Or did you take action to address what, if any, systemic issues were going on that allowed this to happen? And then we might send you a letter and say, you know, we're very sorry that this happened, but what are you doing, board, in order to uphold your fiduciary duties to make sure that this doesn't happen again? And this can be in the area of embezzlement. This can be in the area of a major wrongful related party transaction. Oops, we messed up and one of our directors got a contract, a consulting contract for not doing anything. Okay, that might happen once, but what did you do as a board to then remediate and improve your internal policies and procedures so it doesn't continue happening? And that, I think, is really where the regulators are focused.
Absolutely.
I'll add that I think that listing enforcement actions, whether it's through Nasco or we have a newsletter that goes out and we publish our enforcement actions. I think it provides sometimes an opportunity for other charities out there to say, oh, wow, I better be careful. Or, wow, I never thought about that. We should take a look in our organization to make sure that this isn't likely to happen to us. And it gives an impression that, you know, we take charitable activities pretty seriously in the state of Ohio, and we expect you to do things in a caring way. And it also helps prompt quality complaints that people will make us aware of problems in other charities. And so the other thing that sometimes happens, and that I proactively do, is we'll have an enforcement action against one group, and depending on what the situation is, I might reach out to a statewide association that does that sort of work and say, look here, there's a problem here. Let's make sure it's not going on with any of your other groups and do some training. Or, you know, we have PTA and booster group cases all the time. So we'll go do training in a particular county and invite all the school districts to send their parent reps to a training so we can make sure the same thing doesn't happen again. But that one enforcement case can sometimes provide a like, oh, there, but for the grace of God go I, and it wakes people up in terms of paying attention to what their legal obligations have always been as charitable leaders.
Absolutely.
It always helps when, you know, Eric, it always helps. It always helps when the charity, if they have recognized that there's an issue or a problem, that they let our office know right away and that they're dealing with it. I mean, that is the best thing that they can do, is to stave off, you know, concern of our office. If, you know, it's so much better to hear from the charity, hey, we had this happen. Here's how we're dealing with it. This is what we're doing. We want you to know, you know, we've got it under control. We're working, you know, with our insurance agents or whatever it may be, you know, or we're working with the authorities in such and such a town. If it's a theft of funds of the charity, whatever it is, it's always helpful to hear from the charity that, you know, they know there's an issue and they're working on it and they're dealing with it, and the board is doing the best that they can do to try to handle the situation. And sometimes charities will come to us and ask how we can help. I mean, we can't give legal advice, but there are things, you know, and resources that we can point them to when they need assistance. And we much would rather have them come in and fess up, or give us a call and fess up and say, you know, we've had this issue arise, rather than reading about it in the papers or hearing about it from a consumer complaint. That way we can work with the charity rather than working across the table from the charity.
Well put. I don't think I've ever advocated for the ostrich defense, so to speak. Just bury your head in the ground and the problem will go away. And notwithstanding our earlier discussion of limited resources, my experience is that you guys have the resources to find out what's going on more often than not. We just have a minute or two remaining. I'm going to do my best to consolidate a couple of questions from people who have dialed in, and I guess I'll consolidate it as follows. These both relate to again, the issue of, you know, gee, during the era of COVID, are we treating anything differently? For example, you know, for small nonprofit organizations that are facing financial hardship, do you all foresee any states foregoing re-registration fees? Or, you know, we talked about fundraising earlier. Do you foresee any unrelated business income issues where, you know, this fundraising, the money's coming in, it's not going, you know, directly to the exempt mission? Any thoughts on those questions?
In terms of changes, states are addressing and making accommodations in many different ways. The state survey that we released, and that's available on our website, has up-to-date information on changes that different states have made. So most often that's going to be relief when it comes to deadlines, relief when it comes to wet signature requirements, notarization requirements. I don't think I've seen fee waivers as of yet. I think it's probably something that, can be communicated to your state, keeping in mind that state budgets are also going to be stretched very thin. So there's going to be a balance to be struck there. And otherwise, I think, it's hard to predict what we're going to see. I think it's going to be, like I said, regulation in the time of recession. And when funds are short, people can sometimes make unwise decisions, but it can also be such an important time, and it is such an important time to regroup, make sure that your board is engaged, that you're meeting, that you're documenting your decisions. And that's really going to be the most important thing if any of your state regulators ever come calling, is to be able to say, we thought about this decision, we had a process, look, here are our contemporaneous notes from that meeting. And if we see a thoughtful process, that's going to get you a lot of the way there to getting deference to your decision making.
We've reached the end of the hour. We're actually a little bit over. We're continuing to get very interesting and thought-provoking questions, including the most recent one. When can we expect nationwide charitable laws in lieu of a state-by-state patchwork? I think I can take that one, which is not anytime soon.
We appreciate that.
Yeah. But this, thank you. So I thought this was wonderful. I joke that our audience doesn't want to hear from people like me. They want to hear from you guys, directly from the regulator's mouth. So thank you so much for the time and the preparation and for all that you do for the sector. Mary, Yael, Beth, have a great day and look forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Stay safe out